Thank you. I have some remarks today, and I've drafted them out. I'd ask that they be available for the record, but I'm going to actually summarize them, so maybe both can be kept as part of the record. I'll submit them in that way.
Objection.
Thank you. It is said that politics is the art of the possible, and I'm afraid that over time, someone might argue that politics has become the art of confusion. There's so much confusion that goes on around issues of significance that in some cases the media or the public has a hard time quite getting to the bottom of what's a fact and what's not a fact. And perhaps in some cases, the confusion is purposefully spread by politicians like me and by others. And so I hope today to be able to reduce some of the confusion for those that are paying attention to this debate. And I'll begin by focusing on some things that I think we can pretty much all agree on. The first is that we as a nation need to invest in our infrastructure. Our highways are often in disrepair. In many places, people spend way too long getting to and from work. People in business that are shipping goods from one place to another find that they get stuck in traffic for long periods of time. That hurts our economy. It makes it difficult for us to be competitive globally. I think we mostly can agree with that. Bridges as well. We've got our structural engineers that say that literally thousands of bridges across this country are in disrepair. Some are in such bad repair that trucks have to go to long distance routes to avoid those bridges that are so damaged. We need also to make an investment in our rail. For some time, I lived in the Northeast. People travel from Boston to New York and New York to Washington and so forth on Amtrak. And in many cases, it takes almost as long to get along those places on Amtrak as it would be to drive because the rail is in such disrepair and because we compete on that, passengers compete on that rail with freight. And so we need to upgrade our rail system. Our transit is in many cases also in disrepair, and we use old technology for a lot of our rail cars. Modern technology has the cars themselves that are powered as opposed to being pulled by a huge locomotive or engine. We can improve the technologies we're using. We're just out of date there. And I believe in buses. I think that we can do a better job connecting communities through transit systems like buses that can change their routes as commuting routes also change. I think we can agree that broadband ought to be available to all Americans, whether in rural areas or in low-income areas. Kids need to be able to connect to their school and get their assignments and follow what's going on in the world through the media, through the internet. People need to be able to use telehealth to get consults with doctors. And if we're going to have economic growth in depressed areas of our urban areas or in our rural parts of our country, we need to have businesses know that they have access to high-speed internet or they simply won't go there. Our water systems are in need of repair. We have some water systems that date back 100 years, pipelines back 100 years. We're going to have to upgrade some of these. We have lead pipes, such as in Flint, Michigan. That disaster there can't be repeated anywhere else, and we have to do a better job making sure that we don't have an adjustment of the pH in the water such that we have lead pipes begin to leach. In some cases, we're going to need to remove and replace lead pipes. Wildfires are becoming a bigger and bigger issue on the American West, and we need to have a better program to mitigate and prevent wildfires. Our power grid, in many cases, needs to be upgraded. It's vulnerable to cyber attack. It's also vulnerable to various weather events that have caused blackouts in various parts of our country. Fortunately, with regards to power, in this legislation, we also add some efforts to look at new technologies, nuclear, hydrogen, battery power, and so forth, as a way to reduce our dependence on oil and gas. Permitting reform. I think we also recognize that sometimes it takes us way too long for projects to get underway, and that adds to cost, and it's frustrating to consumers as well. All these elements and more are addressed in this bipartisan infrastructure agreement that's before the Senate right now. That's what this bill is all about, addressing those infrastructure needs. I would note that this is not a partisan issue. It has not been. Every modern president, well, I should say every president in the modern era, has proposed an infrastructure package, the need to improve our infrastructure. President Trump, the last administration, proposed a $1.5 trillion plan. Now, the bipartisan proposal is $550 billion, about 1/3 of President Trump's proposal. Now, again, confusion sometimes reigns here because we hear all sorts of numbers, but this is $550 billion above what we normally spend. So if you add in what we normally spend, that gets you to the higher number of about $1 trillion. People talk about that, but that's a different matter. That's the normal run rate over the 5 years. If you add that to the $550 billion, you get almost $1 trillion. There's confusion also about how many pages there are. I mean, the reality is, yeah, there are 2,700 pages in this bill. And I think the public says, how in the world can anyone possibly read something like that and keep up with it? Well, as the presiding officer knows, about 2,000 pages of this were already passed by the various committees of jurisdiction. And some of the people that are most vocal criticizing these 2,700 pages to read, they've had access to those 2,000 pages or portions of them already because they're on the committees that pass them. And of course, in addition to the 2,000 pages, there are other pages that have been written and are before committees to consider. Something else I'd note, and that is, in addition to not having raised taxes to pay for this $550 billion infrastructure program, this bill is paid for. The Congressional Budget Office has scored about 1/2 of it as being paid for under their rules. The other half is also paid for by real dollars. Not the way CBO scores it under their rules, but just as real. Sometimes, for instance, a pile of funding, a pile of cash, has been previously allocated and not used. And so it goes back to the Treasury, and the CBO says, well, we can't score that because it's already been appropriated once. I understand that, but it's real dollars. And you might say, well, why don't we just let it go back to the Treasury and reduce the deficit? Let me tell you something. That'll never happen because our Democrat friends are planning on putting in place a $3.5 trillion bill of their own, which would surely grab all of that money and everything else that comes along. So it's not going to go back into the accounts of the federal government to reduce the Treasury, to reduce the deficit and the debt. It's instead going to be used on the spending spree that my colleagues across the aisle are planning on carrying out soon. I affectionately call that $3.5 trillion spending spree the blue whale. It's very, very large, the largest. It's soft and it's blue, but ours is going to be used for real hard infrastructure. Of course, it's about 1/7 the size of the blue whale, and I might call it the Roadrunner by comparison. Now, I recognize that there's been some criticism of this bill, and it's not without faults. It was, after all, the product of work by Republicans and Democrats. 10 of us were tasked by our group of 22 to see if we could come up with something. And to get Republicans and Democrats to agree to something together means that there's some things we like better and some things my colleagues across the aisle like better. There's some things, if it were just up to Republicans, we wouldn't have in there. And my guess is there's some things, if it were just up to Democrats, they wouldn't have in there. But it was, after all, a meeting of people from both parties to find something that could actually get a bill done. Because as the presiding officer knows, we've had several presidents try and get a bill done, and it's never gotten across the finish line. So this was an effort to say, let's break the logjam and get something actually accomplished so we can deal with the infrastructure challenges that we virtually all agree America faces. Now, criticism is expected, and I note criticism is also pretty easy. Anytime you have a bill that's worked out by compromise between two sides, why, the side that looks at the other side's work is going to criticize it. And I can point at all the things I don't like about the bill. I won't waste anyone's time doing that. I do ask my colleagues, okay, if you don't like this bill, what bill do you like instead? What would you do instead? President Trump's $1.5 trillion bill? How would you pay for that one? What would you spend that money on? Because ours is 1/3 the size of that proposal. So one can stop and say, what would you do instead? I know some people would say, well, nothing at all. We don't want to spend any money at all. No bill. Let's not spend a dollar in infrastructure. That's, I'm afraid, not an option in reality, because we have two options. One is to accept the bipartisan work of our respective colleagues, and the other is just to say, hey, because the Democrats have the House and the Senate and the White House, just let them do it all by themselves, without any Republican input at all. And I'm pleased that the president decided not to take that course, and the Democrat leadership here in the Senate concluded as well that's not the right course to take, that a bipartisan approach was better. But let me note that if the option were taken to have a Democrat-only bill, my estimate is that it would cost about $500 billion more than our $550 billion bill, that it would expand union rights through Davis-Bacon with prevailing wages on areas where it's not currently existent. There'd be more money going into things like transit and Amtrak, more money for lead pipes, more money for administrative costs. We hold administrative costs down to 3% of this bill. There were many efforts to try and raise that as high as 10%. That would mean tens of thousands of new federal government employees. We held it down to 3%. That, in my opinion, would change if it were simply a partisan one-party bill. We made some of these funding efforts into loan programs where states or people who would take advantage of the funding would ultimately pay them back. My guess is if it were a bill that did not have our input, some of those would be transferred into grants. Now, there's another criticism that gets raised, and that's that this bipartisan agreement and the bill before us is just a gateway to the blue whale, that this is going to open the door to the $3.5 trillion plan that the president has proposed. I don't really follow that one terribly well, that argument, because obviously if there's no agreement on this legislation, if it doesn't pass or if the House blows it up in some way, why then this effort, the hard infrastructure effort, will just be added to the blue whale, to the $3.5 trillion. That's going to get done anyway, and this would become part of that. So there's going to be an effort to pass a blue whale one way or the other. I hope that doesn't pass, by the way, but this is not just going to go, this is not a gateway to anything, but a gateway to better roads, better bridges, better water, better broadband into rural communities, and a better economic vitality for our country. Now, I do admit that I do understand and appreciate the argument that's being made, one criticism that's being made against this bill by some in my party, which is by being in favor of this legislation for $550 billion, we're going to confuse the voters, and they're going to think that we're also all just part of this big blue whale thing. We're spending $550, and my colleagues across the aisle want to spend $3.5 trillion, and it's all just one big, massive spending mess, and it's going to be hard for the voters to understand the difference, and we're going to get blamed for the whole mess. I subscribe to what Lindsey Graham said. He said, I think we can make it pretty clear to our voters that we love one and we hate the other. That's what my Republican colleagues would hopefully say. That's the way I feel. I love one, I hate the other. But I happen to feel that this is not so much a matter of confusion as a matter of recognition of what's right for America. Because by being for this bill, even though there is a risk of some confusion, we do save about $500 billion for the American people and reduce the deficit over time by about $500 billion. We do restrict Davis-Bacon from being expanded into areas where it's not now. We do hold down some of the transit spending and the Amtrak spending. We hold down administrative costs and the number of federal employees that are going to be hired for these programs. So, in my opinion, we have to put aside sometimes the politics for what's absolutely right for America. I'm sure some people are a little disturbed when they see headlines that say, oh, this bipartisan effort would look like a win for Biden. Well, it's a win for Republicans, and it's a win for Biden, it's a win for Democrats, it's a win for the Senate to say we can work together, that we've been able to overcome partisan differences to do something that's right for America. Mr. President, I'm convinced that this is a win for America. I support this legislation. I'm proud to have been part of the effort to help draft it and negotiate it. I admire and respect my colleagues on both sides of the aisle that have worked on this legislation. We calculated just the other day that we had had over 50 meetings amongst that group of individuals, just ones that I attended, over the last several months in preparation for this bill. It is not a slap-together effort. It was carefully considered. It was drawn upon and built upon legislation already passed by committees, overwhelmingly, time and time again, wherever we could. And I certainly hope that the senators from both sides of the aisle will join together in passing this legislation, sending it to the House, that the House will address it in a way that's consistent with what we have agreed to, and we can send it to the President and help America finally get its infrastructure in order. Thank you, Mr. President.